You are not a warrior. Not tonight. Tonight, you are something quieter, something that breathes in stillness. You lie on your back, the weight of your limbs pressing gently into the futon, your ears tuned not to battle cries, but to the hush between wind gusts. The room around you does not flicker with lantern light. It merely waits, ancient, patient, holding its breath like the trees outside. And in that space between silence and memory, a door opens. You do not walk through it. You drift. Somewhere beyond the veil of centuries, before your grandparents were born, a man woke up smiling. Not a warrior smile, tight, subdued, born of calculation, but a smile too wide for the face that held it. A grin, almost juvenile, stretching under a face lined by command and stained with too many indulgences. His name is no longer remembered, not because it was unworthy, but because it was inconvenient. Power is only respected when it behaves, and he did not. The castle he lived in wasn't particularly large, not by the standards of emperors or gods, but it was large enough to echo, large enough to amplify the sound of a man's laughter until it seemed like mockery. The servants heard it first, curling around corners like smoke, seeping into walls. The samurai heard it next and did not speak of it, not yet. Because in the lands of blades and bowed heads, discomfort is a warning sign sharper than steel. This is not a tale of war or conquest. It is not blood that stains this history. It is something softer, stickier, something that lingers in the air long after it should have vanished. The kind of shame that speaks in glances. The kind that leaves no wound, but still demands bandages. You might think this is scandal. You would be wrong. This is bureaucracy's nightmare, when protocol meets appetite and neither flinches. Picture a man who had everything, except moderation. Imagine a leader whose hands never touched a blade, but whose gaze touched too often, too long, too uninvited. He did not assault. He did not confess. He merely existed in a way that made others flinch, and that was, in the end, enough. Enough to inspire distance, enough to sour the tea, enough to end a legacy without ever lifting a sword. Tonight, your task is not to forgive him, nor is it to despise him. You are here to witness, to lie still and let time tell you a secret that history buried beneath honor codes and temple rituals. You are here to feel what it was like to be near someone everyone tolerated until they didn't. Someone too human, too visible, in a world that prized masks over faces. Listen closely now. The footsteps you hear are not coming closer. They are walking away. A man is being erased, not with fury, not with fire, but with politeness. And so we begin, not with a battle cry, but with a breath held too long. The story of a man too loud for a world built on silence. The story of a shogun who smiled when he should have bowed. It began with sound, not the clang of steel or the hush of ink on scrolls, but laughter. Warm, intrusive, and too frequent. In a place where discipline was worn like armor, his laughter felt misplaced. Not wicked, not cruel, just persistent and out of place, like a child clapping in a funeral procession. He would chuckle during morning rituals, grin during temple visits, and smirk when speaking to those beneath him, which, of course, meant everyone. The samurai noticed, they always did. But at first, they said nothing. Silence, after all, was the first law. No edict was needed to define what was acceptable. The code of Bushido was not written in ink, it was inscribed in gesture, in posture, in breath. You were not supposed to smile unless someone else bled for it. You were not supposed to speak unless spoken to. You were certainly not supposed to lean too close to a shrine maiden, or brush your fingers across silk robes that weren't yours, or hum lewd songs under your breath while a retainer stood 2 feet away pretending not to hear. But he did all that, not with violence, not with menace, just with a kind of performative ease that unsettled even the bravest warriors. He would comment on the softness of a young monk's hands. He would wink, casually, reflexively, at the daughters of elders, even as their fathers stood beside them. He thought it was charm. They called it rot, a kind that didn't stink, but spread just the same. "He smiles too much," someone said one afternoon, after the shogun passed through the temple gate with that same irreverent twinkle in his eye. It wasn't a condemnation, it wasn't even a complaint, it was an observation, but one that traveled like a spark through dry rice fields. The phrase began to repeat itself, around wells, behind screens, in the pauses between sips of tea. He smiles too much, and that, just that, was the beginning of the end. Honor in the samurai world wasn't built on grand heroics. It was woven from small, invisible threads: modesty, restraint, a particular quiet dignity that even death could not stain. The shogun broke none of the official rules, yet he violated all of them. His presence became a discomfort they could not explain, a ripple that upset the still water of their discipline. Imagine a man who walks into a garden and tries to seduce a cherry blossom. That was his way. Not cruel, just inappropriate. And what is more dangerous than a man who does not understand the atmosphere he poisons? Not because he's evil, but because he thinks he's amusing, because he believes the rules were made for someone else, because he never imagined that silence, once broken, could turn into judgment with no voice and no mercy. The morning did not arrive with reverence for him, it arrived with unease. The tatami mats beneath his feet, once swept and bowed to, now groaned under his steps. Not from weight, but from intent, from the way he lingered in thresholds too long, from the way his heel dragged, as if seeking to be heard. You could tell when he was awake, not by the rooster's crow, but by the change in the air, the tension that spread like steam through wooden halls. Servants straightened their backs, maids tied their sashes tighter, the silence sharpened. His routine was not one of discipline or contemplation, as tradition prescribed. It was performance. His baths were long and scented, not to cleanse, but to be noticed. The steam that rose from the cedar tub carried not peace, but pretense. A maid would be summoned, not for service, but to see. He lounged as if waiting for admiration, or at least reaction, but they gave him neither. Only lowered gazes, clenched jaws, quick retreats. You could hear it in their steps, short, rehearsed, practiced to pass by him as if he were smoke. He dressed slowly, deliberately, fingers pausing at the collar, not out of care, but calculation. He wanted to be looked at, but he was not seen. Not anymore. They stopped laughing at his jokes a year ago. They stopped answering them months later. Now he told them to himself, chuckling into empty rooms where only incense and disinterest lingered. Meals arrived in silence. Pickled radish, salted fish, warm rice, and sake poured with robotic politeness. The food was hot. The atmosphere was glacial. He tried to banter with the cook once. He didn't try again. At mealtime, he sat alone. surrounded by retainers who barely chewed, barely breathed, waiting only to leave. One brave samurai once complimented his robe, and the shogun reached to touch his cheek. That compliment was never repeated, and neither was the contact. The days passed, not with dignity, but with avoidance. No one denied him. That would have been open rebellion. Instead, they granted him everything, while looking away. 1,000 small permissions that screamed disapproval. 1,000 quiet nods that tasted like shame. His world was not empty. It was overfull with eyes that never met his. Discomfort is not loud. It is chronic, a persistent fever in the soul of a house. He would stroll the gardens in the afternoon, under plum blossoms too wise to bloom early. He'd bend near them, whisper something unfunny, and smile to himself. No one followed. The pond, once surrounded by admirers, now reflected only him. And even the koi swam deeper when he leaned over the edge. By nightfall, he would drink. Not from sorrow, but out of habit. His hand steady, his smirk intact, but his voice softer, as if waiting for laughter that never came. He wasn't alone, not in the literal sense, but every face around him had become a wall. Every gesture, a rejection sealed in politeness. This is how exile begins, not with banishment, but with a room full of people who refuse to acknowledge that you are still there. Disgrace rarely arrives with thunder. It comes like mist, slow, creeping, barely visible until everything is wet and cold and quietly rotting. At first, it was nothing. A tray brought with less care. A guard at the gate who bowed an inch too shallow. A maid whose hands trembled while pouring the tea. Small acts, petty almost, but the shogun noticed. Not because he was perceptive, but because the world had once bent itself to his smallest moods, and now it resisted him, gently. The whispers came next. Not rumors, not slander, just sighs. Just tired, strained conversations held behind closed sliding doors, in kitchens where rice boiled too long. One said he lingered too close. Another said he touched her sleeve when there was no need. No bruises, no screams, only the kind of touches that made the air feel heavy afterward. The kind that stayed on the skin even after a dozen washes. The kind that didn't draw swords, but drew glances, sharp, judgmental, silent. A young samurai, barely of age, confessed to dreaming of the shogun. Not in fear, not in desire, just in discomfort. He was near me, he said, but not violent, just watching. That was enough. In this village, shame echoed louder than any act, and discomfort, it bred faster than disease.
There was no name for what he did, no word for the way he looked too long at someone bowing, or how his laughter rose a little too fast after someone tripped, or how his compliments lingered like sweat on silk. He wasn't monstrous. He was simply wrong, misaligned, like a painting hung slightly askew on a temple wall, harmless until you couldn't unsee it. One monk stopped entering the tea room after dusk, said the scent made him uneasy. One elder requested to eat in his quarters, claiming an upset stomach. Another began to kneel less deeply when the shogun passed. Tiny rebellions, courteous, well-mannered, and damning. And still, he smiled. Still, he bathed thrice daily. Still, he wore robes too vivid for his age, too soft for a warrior. Perhaps he didn't see it coming, or perhaps he did, and simply hoped charm would once again rescue him. But charm, like a blade, dulls if misused. What made him unbearable was not cruelty, it was persistence, the exhausting presence of someone who never stopped trying to be adored in a room that had grown allergic to him. He had become a man no one could accuse, but everyone wanted gone. That is the tragedy of discomfort. It doesn't scream, it settles, and when it has settled long enough, it becomes truth, not because it is proven, but because it is no longer denied. It happened on a night so ordinary that even the moon refused to shine too brightly. The sake was warm, the lamps flickered, and the air hummed with forced conviviality, the kind of polite joy that tastes like vinegar when swallowed. He was invited with ceremony, with lacquered chopsticks, embroidered cushions, and just enough bowing to seem sincere. He came dressed in silk the color of plum blossoms, his fan painted with cranes mid-flight. He believed, perhaps, that the tide had turned, that whatever storm had brewed in silence had passed. There was no confrontation, no shouting, no steel drawn in the name of honor, just a table, a meal, and a letter, folded neatly beside his rice bowl, as if it were a menu. He reached for it between bites of pickled daikon, unfolded it slowly, with a smirk already blooming across his lips. The others watched in silence, not cruelly, not eagerly, just waiting, as one waits for incense to burn down to ash. The letter did not accuse, it did not explain, it simply stated what needed to be done. He would leave, tonight, without protest, without entourage. He had become inconvenient. He laughed. Of course he did. At first, a short breath of disbelief, then louder, then harder, as if laughter could crack the weight of what had just been handed to him. But no one joined, no one echoed. His sound bounced off the lacquered walls and fell flat on the tatami. It was then, only then, that the smirk wavered. The man who had always smiled, who had charmed and chuckled and winked and teased, looked around and found nothing reflecting back. Not even pity.
The irony was brutal in its elegance. The man exiled, not for crimes, but for grins too wide, for gazes too warm, for a joy that made others cold. In a land where silence was sacred, his laughter had become a curse. The samurai didn't need to swing blades. Their silence did the cutting. He bowed once, deeply. A final performance. No tears, just a stiffness in the shoulders, the kind that comes when pride begins to shatter but hasn't fully crumbled yet. Exile here was not a punishment of rage. It was the most refined cruelty, polite, ceremonial, irreversible. And when he turned to leave, the banquet resumed, quietly, efficiently, as if a shadow had been lifted from the room. He hadn't been killed, but something had died. Something in the sound of his own voice as it failed to find a place to land. He left before sunrise, when even the roosters were unsure whether to announce the day. The air was thick with the weight of what had not been said, and the gravel under his sandals seemed to hesitate before allowing him passage. There were no drums, no horses, no guards, just the soft swish of silk robes brushing against a world that no longer made room for him. In his hand, a fan, painted with plum blossoms, now wilting at the edges. On his face, a smile, fragile, ceremonial, and entirely alone. No possessions weighed him down, except for the memory of being needed once. The village gate did not creak for him. The sentries did not salute. One of them bowed, yes, but with his eyes fixed on the dirt. That was all he was now, a form to be acknowledged but not seen.
The path he walked had once welcomed him with processions, music, and petals tossed by children too young to understand the cost of reverence. Now, the same path whispered indifference. Stones that had known the pressure of armored feet now barely registered the ghost of his steps. He passed a farmer tending to his field. The man straightened his back, wiped his brow, and offered a bow as dry as the soil he worked. No greeting, no curiosity, just that polite, hollow gesture required by etiquette, not by heart. The sun climbed slowly, as if reluctant to light this particular journey. By mid-morning, his shadow was the only companion that dared follow him. By noon, even that had shrunk beneath his feet. And by evening, he was little more than a silhouette, swallowed by the horizon. There was no destination, only departure. Each step was an erasure, a quiet peeling away of identity. Without attendants to carry his name, it slipped from him with the dust on his hem. Without walls to echo his voice, even his breath seemed borrowed. He did not stop to rest. He did not eat. There was nothing left that needed sustenance. And somewhere along that road, between the place where people no longer remembered him and the place where no one had ever heard of him, he became something else. Not a shogun, not a pervert, not even a man of exile. Just a traveler, unnamed, unwelcomed, unmourned. Not every exile ends in blood. Some end in a long, slow fading, like ink left out in the rain. There is no battlefield here, no grand tragedy carved in stone. Just a man, once powerful, now erased, not by sword, but by silence. He was not evil. That is too simple a word for what he was. Too dramatic, too clean. He was merely misaligned. A creature of desire born into a world that demanded austerity. A man of laughter in a temple of solemnness. And when the rhythms of the land no longer matched the beat of his presence, he was cast out, not for what he did, but for what he made others feel. In another time, another place, he might have been a storyteller, a host, the favorite eccentric at court. But here, in this brittle corner of history, he became a blemish, a ripple in a culture that punished discomfort more harshly than deceit. There is something tragic in that, something terribly human. Perhaps that is why you remember him tonight. Why in the stillness of your room, beneath soft light and humming electricity, your thoughts drift to a man who once smiled too wide, in a room full of men who preferred not to smile at all. You do not excuse him, but you understand. Modern life forgives oddness. It even celebrates it sometimes. But back then, there was no tolerance for asymmetry, no space for quirks that could not be straightened with steel. You picture him now, not as a villain, nor as a victim, but as a shadow under strange stars. He does not rage against his fate. He does not plead. He simply walks. Because what else can one do when one's very presence has become a burden? And maybe that's the cruelest exile of all. Not the kind with walls and guards, but the kind where no one calls your name, where your footsteps are swallowed by wind and your memory by silence. You lie there, listening to the wind, to your breath, to the distant echo of a man forgotten by his world. And in that quiet space, you realize something else. The past never vanishes. It just waits, in silence, in shame, in the stories no one wanted to tell, until now.